Earth remained silent for centuries, until the Galactic Council went too far. The distress signal lasted 11 seconds. Then it stopped. Not because the problem was solved, but because the person sending it knew that no one in the galaxy would answer. No one except us, and we were already moving. I had been awake for 31 hours when the signal came in from Alien. I was sitting in the monitoring bay of Lunar Station 7, a long dark room, carved into the rock of the moon's far side, where no natural light had ever touched, and the walls hummed with the quiet business of 300 years of watching. My coffee was cold, my eyes were dry, and when the signal hit my consoles, every tired thought I had vanished in an instant. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened at Alien, you first have to understand why Earth was silent for so long. And to understand that, you have to go back to the year 2087, when the galaxy first spoke to us, and we made the most important decision in the history of our species. We decided not to answer. My name is Asha Marin. I am 61 years old, and for the last 22 years, I have served as Earth's Senior Diplomatic Observer, which is a complicated title for a very simple job. I watch, I listen, I report. I have spent most of my adult life inside monitoring stations like this one, reading transmissions from species that do not know I exist, learning languages that no human was supposed to know, building a picture of a galaxy that believed it had no idea we were here. The funny thing about silence is that everyone assumes it means you have nothing to say. The galaxy looked at Earth, heard nothing, and decided we were primitive, undeveloped. A quiet little world in an unremarkable spiral arm, still figuring out how to leave our own solar system. Something to check on occasionally, the way you might glance at a bird's nest you found in the garden. Harmless. Small. Unaware we were none of those things. The first transmission from the Galactic Council reached Earth on the 14th of March, 2087. It was not a greeting. It was not an invitation. It was a legal document. A 40-page declaration of resource zones, trade exclusions, and territorial classifications that carved up entire star systems the way a banker divides property on paper. Buried on page 31, in language so dry it barely qualified as a warning, was a clause for what they called undeveloped civilizations. The clause said, in plain terms, that any species without registered faster-than-light capability was classified as pre-contact, and pre-contact worlds had no standing to claim resources, territory, or legal protection under council law. They were telling us, politely and efficiently, that we did not exist yet. The people who read that transmission were not angry. They were something quieter and more dangerous than angry. They were certain that answering would give the council exactly what it wanted. A vulnerable, unregistered world with no fleet, no allies, and no leverage, announcing itself before it was ready. Certain that silence was not weakness. It was the most powerful move available to us. And so Earth went quiet. What followed were 3 centuries of the most disciplined effort in human history. While the galaxy watched our solar system and saw nothing of interest, we were building. Shipyards hidden deep inside the asteroid belt, disguised as natural formations, turning out vessels that made Council standard technology look like antiques. Research stations buried in the ice moons of the outer planets, working on biology, materials science, and energy systems that the Council had never imagined. And spread across 7 star systems that the Council's charts listed as barren and uninhabitable, quiet human colonies were growing cities, raising children, and planting fields under foreign suns. We built off the map, we built in the dark, and we watched. Lunar Station 7 was one of 44 such stations positioned throughout the galaxy, each one cloaked, each one staffed by a small rotating team of people like me. Our ships traveled disguised as debris, as dead probes, as ancient relics from civilizations the Council had long forgotten. We sat inside their communication channels, the way a careful person sits inside a crowded room, learning every voice, every argument, every secret. We knew which species had alliances and which ones had old grievances dressed up as alliances. We knew which council members accepted payments from private interests. We knew the patrol routes of every major fleet in the galaxy, and we had been updating those routes continuously for 260 years. The Council knew none of this. To them, we were a quiet blue world with no ships and no voice, and they had long since stopped checking. I often think about the moment they stopped being curious about us. I think it was sometimes in the 22nd century, when a junior council researcher filed a report recommending Earth for a formal contact evaluation, and a senior administrator rejected it on the grounds that there was nothing there worth the bureaucratic effort. That administrator went on to have a distinguished career. He received several awards. He never knew he had made the most expensive mistake in the history of the Galactic Council. What I was doing in those years, and what my colleagues were doing in every monitoring station across the galaxy was not exciting in the way stories usually describe this kind of work. It was long. It was patient. It was the work of sitting still and paying attention when every instinct said to act. I watched species rise into the council with great ceremony and watched others quietly lose their independence to council economic policies within a generation. I watched wars get started over access to a particular mineral and watched the same wars get ended when the mineral turned out to be less valuable than the cost of fighting over it. I watched powerful species bully smaller ones and watched the council's justice system find technical reasons to look away. I took notes, I sent reports, I drank a great deal of cold coffee. The station around me that night was quiet in the way it always was during a night rotation, which is to say that it was technically always night here on the far side of the moon. But we kept time by a 24-hour Earth clock, and it was 2 in the morning. My colleague Owen Dale was asleep in the rest cabin. The junior analyst on duty, a young woman named Clara Finch, was at the far console reviewing traffic from the Vega corridor, a busy trade lane 300 light-years away that we had been monitoring closely for the past several months. Clara was the one who had started tracking the ECS Meridian's position 2 days earlier, when the ship's cloaking array threw a minor fluctuation that our instruments caught and the Council's did not. The Meridian was one of our observation vessels, a sleek ship built to pass as wreckage. She was running a standard monitoring pass through the Vega corridor when a Vreth patrol destroyer picked her up. Not because they broke our cloak. They did not break our cloak. They picked her up because their patrol commander was following a schedule, and the Meridian happened to be in the exact patch of space he had been assigned to clear. He was not curious about the object he found. He was not careful about it. He saw an unregistered mass in his zone, noted in his log that it appeared to be old survey debris, and did what his orders told him to do with unregistered debris in his patrol zone. He cleared it. I was still reading the alien signal when Clara looked up from her console and said, in a voice that was very carefully steady, that we had a problem in the Vega corridor. I walked over to her station and read the report on her screen. I read it twice. 3 crew members on board the Meridian had not made it to the emergency shelters in time. Their names were Owen Farley, Grace Donnell, and Peter Huang. I had never met any of them. I knew all of their records by heart because knowing your people's records is part of this job, and knowing their names felt like the very least I could do. I stood at Clara's console for a long time. Outside the station, through 200 meters of lunar rock and the vast, empty dark of space, the galaxy went about its business with complete indifference. Trade ships crossed the Vega corridor. Council chambers discussed budgets. Patrol commanders filed their logs and went to dinner. And Earth sat in silence and watched and noted everything and waited for the moment that was, as I had suspected for 20 years, coming faster than anyone had planned. I did not know then how fast. I walked back to my console, sat down, and opened a new report file. At the top, I typed the date, the location, and the incident classification. Then I paused for a moment, looking at the blinking cursor. Then I began to write. When I sent that report to the Earth Strategic Council, I did not expect an answer for several days. The Council operated carefully and slowly by design, which was normally one of its finest qualities. That night, I had my answer in 4 hours. It was not the answer I expected. The message from Director Yun Sato was short. It said that the incident had been reviewed and that a response was being authorized. Not a military response. Not a diplomatic protest. Something quieter, and in my experience, much more effective. It said that I should prepare for a period of elevated activity, and that Lunar Station 7 was being upgraded to active status, effective immediately. I read the message 3 times. Then I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat back down at my console, and thought about what 300 years of patience had just decided to say. The Council's emergency session was still running on its 12th hour when the anonymous message arrived in their secure network. I know because I was watching the session feed on my secondary monitor when it happened. I watched the Council's lead communications officer stop mid-sentence. I watched him read his screen. I watched the color leave his face. The message was 6 words. We counted. We are not done. The room went completely silent. I allowed myself alone in the monitoring bay at 2 in the morning with cold coffee and a blinking cursor. A very small, very quiet smile. It was the first thing Earth had ever said to the Galactic Council. It was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. It was a statement of fact, and every species in that room, with any sense of self-preservation, understood immediately that whoever had sent it was neither afraid nor finished. The investigation that followed lasted 9 months. They looked at every known species. They analyzed the encryption, which had been built to look like nothing they had ever seen, but was actually a deliberately aged version of systems we had stopped using 40 years ago. They brought in their best analysts, their most experienced intelligence teams, their most advanced decryption programs. They found nothing. In their final report, the lead investigator wrote that the message appeared to have originated from an unknown intelligence of considerable technical sophistication, possibly non-biological, possibly connected to a dormant precursor civilization, and that further investigation was strongly recommended. I read that report sitting in the same chair where I had watched the session feed. I noted in my own private log that their best guess was that we were either robots or ghosts. We were neither. We were simply patient. And our patience, after 312 years, was finally running out. The Vreth patrol commander who had ordered the strike on the Meridian was quietly removed from active duty 2 weeks after the anonymous message. The official reason listed in council records was administrative restructuring. No further explanation was given. His name was removed from the duty roster, and he was reassigned to a desk position on a station near the Outer Rim, far from any trade corridors, where he would spend the next decade filing routine atmospheric reports for uninhabited gas giants. I noted that too, not with satisfaction exactly, more with the knowledge that the council understood, on some level, that something had seen what they did and was keeping a record. They were right. We were keeping every record. We'd been for 300 years, and we were very good at it. What none of them knew yet, what none of them could have imagined, was that the anonymous message was not a warning. It was a test. We wanted to see how they responded when they knew someone was watching. We wanted to see if guilt or fear or simple self-interest would make them more careful, more fair, more honest in how they treated the smaller species under their authority. Over the 9 months following the message, I tracked 847 council actions involving smaller, unregistered, or pre-contact worlds. I documented each one in detail. I sent my reports to the Earth Strategic Council every week, and every week Director Sato read them and made his careful notes. Of those 847 actions, 31 showed meaningful improvement. The remaining 816 showed no change at all. I remember the morning I submitted that final summary report. I sat for a while after sending it, looking at my screen, thinking about 300 years of watching and waiting and building and being patient, and about 31 actions out of 847 that suggested things might improve on their own. I thought about Owen Farley, Grace Donnell, and Peter Huang. Then I thought about Elian, which had been a quiet colony of 2.3 million people for 80 years, built on a world the Council had classified as barren. Because their surveys were not thorough enough to detect life signs in the Northern Hemisphere's underground aquifer system, where our engineers had built the first settlement before expanding to the surface. Elian had farms, it had schools. It had a market square in the main city where people gathered on weekend mornings to buy fresh produce and argue about local politics. I had read the colony reports for years. I knew the governor's name. I knew the names of the 2 rival football teams that had dominated the Colony League for the last decade. And I knew that 6 weeks after my final summary report landed on Director Sato's desk, the Galactic Council passed Resolution 7 Omicron, which opened every unregistered system in the Vega-adjacent sector to Council member resource extraction, effective immediately. Elian was inside that sector. When the Council survey ships arrived at Elian and found cities instead of rock, they did not stop. They did not report back for instructions. Their orders said the sector was cleared for extraction, and their orders did not include a provision for finding 2.3 million people living where no one was supposed to be. So they began extraction operations on the southern continent, where the mineral deposits were richest and the population was thinnest. The colony governor, a steady woman named Frances Cole, sent her distress signal at 0340 local time. It lasted 11 seconds. She was calm in the recording. She gave the coordinates, the nature of the incursion, the number of council vessels present, and the status of her people. Then she ended the transmission with 4 words that I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "I trust you're listening." She had never been told about the monitoring stations. She had never been given any indication that Earth had a fleet, or that anyone was watching, or that the silence of 300 years was a strategy rather than a limitation. She was simply a person who believed in the deepest and most practical way that her planet would not abandon her. I was listening. Every station in the network was listening. And in the deep dark of the asteroid belt, and in the cold outer reaches of 7 different star systems, and in the quiet interior of the most powerful unregistered fleet in the history of the galaxy, 300 years of patience came to a very deliberate and very precise end. Director Sato's authorization came through at 0412. It was 2 sentences long. The first sentence activated the emergence protocol. The second sentence said, "Give them the chair." I did not fully understand what he meant by that last part until much later, but I was about to find out. I will tell you what the emergence protocol sounded like from inside a monitoring station on the moon, because I think people imagine it as something loud and dramatic, full of alarms, and shouted orders and the roar of engines. It was not any of those things. It sounded like silence ending. For 300 years, Earth's presence in the galaxy had been a held breath. Every ship running dark, every station running quiet, every transmission encoded and minimized, and tucked so carefully into the background noise of space that even our own people sometimes had to remind themselves how much was out there. We had become so good at being invisible that invisibility had started to feel natural, normal, like the correct state of things. What happened in the 48 hours after Director Sato's authorization was the exhale. I was at my console when the first decloaking signals began appearing on my board. Not alarms, not warnings. Just new lights, one by one, coming online across a galaxy that had spent 3 centuries telling itself those lights did not exist. First, the Deep Belt shipyards, 41 of them, each one larger than any Council military installation by a significant margin. Then the Outer System research stations, 17 in total, their communication arrays switching from passive receive to full broadcast for the first time in living memory. Then the colony worlds, 6 of the 7 going to open signal status, their populations of tens of thousands each, stepping out from behind 3 centuries of deliberate quiet and simply being present, undisguised, on the galactic map. And then the fleet. I had seen the fleet's numbers and reports for years. I knew the figures. But seeing a number in a document is not the same as watching 1,400 ships appear on a galactic tracking board simultaneously, which is what happened at 0600 on the morning after Director Sato's authorization, when Admiral Camille Voss activated the Elian response group, and every ship in it dropped its cloak at the same moment. The Council's monitor systems, which covered the Vega-adjacent sector in detail, registered the event as a catastrophic sensor malfunction. It took their technicians 11 minutes to accept that the readings were accurate. In those 11 minutes, Admiral Voss moved her fleet to a position between the Council extraction ships and Elian's 2 moons, arranged them in a formation that their own tactical programs would have described as overwhelming, and opened a standard hailing frequency. Then she waited. I was watching the Council's internal communications feed when their commanders at Elian first saw Voss's fleet. I will not try to describe the exact content of those communications because this is not that kind of record. What I will say is that the response was immediate, loud, and made entirely of disbelief. 200 Council warships, the largest deployment in Council history, had arrived at Elian expecting to reinforce a routine extraction operation. They had arrived expecting, at most, a small and poorly equipped local resistance that would need no more than a standard show of force to resolve. What they found instead was a wall of ships that their sensors told them were more advanced than anything in Council registry. A wall whose formation covered every possible exit vector from the Elian system. A wall that had appeared from nowhere, and was now sitting between them and the planet with the quiet, settled patience of something that had been planning this moment for a very long time. Admiral Voss did not hail the Council fleet commanders directly. She sent her opening communication to every ship simultaneously, which is not standard Council protocol, and was itself a message. The communication was not a demand, and it was not a threat. It was a document. It was a tactical brief. It contained, in precise and thoroughly sourced detail, a complete breakdown of the Council fleet's current formation, the specific vulnerabilities in each ship class present, the optimal engagement sequence for neutralizing the fleet in order of threat priority, and a calculated time-to-completion figure for a full engagement scenario. The figure was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I read the document before it was sent. I had helped compile the underlying data over the course of 2 decades of monitoring. Every patrol route, every hull spec, every weapons system rating. We had not gathered that information to threaten anyone. We had gathered it because knowing things is what keeps people alive, and we had been keeping people alive through knowledge for 300 years. But it was also, at this particular moment, extraordinarily useful as a communication tool. The Council Fleet Commander, a senior Vreth officer named Torek Vaughn, sat with that document for 6 minutes before responding. I tracked the internal communications on his vessel during those 6 minutes. He had 3 conversations with his senior staff. The conversations were short. Then he sent a single transmission to Admiral Voss's flagship. He said, "What are you?" Voss's response came back in under 10 seconds, she said, annoyed. There was a pause of approximately 40 seconds on Torek Vaughn's end. Then the council fleet began to stand down. It took 3 hours to complete the withdrawal of extraction teams from Elian's surface. Human ground forces, which had been stationed on the planet for 11 years as part of the colony's undisclosed defense arrangement, escorted the council teams to their shuttles with complete professionalism. Every piece of extracted material was catalogued, loaded into council cargo holds, and then formally logged as evidence in an as-yet unfiled complaint. The damaged infrastructure on the southern continent was photographed, measured, and documented in a report that ran to 47 pages. The report was addressed to the Galactic Council's Office of Legal Affairs. The return address was Earth. It was the first piece of official correspondence Earth had ever sent to the Council. It was not a greeting. It was not an introduction. It was an invoice. I was in my monitoring bay when the confirmation came through that Elian was clear. Clara Finch was at her console, tracking the withdrawal. Owen Dale had come back from the rest cabin hours ago and was standing at the back of the room with a cup of tea, watching the boards. None of us said anything for a moment. We had been in this room for a very long time. We had spent years watching and waiting and recording, and now the thing we had been recording toward had happened, and the galaxy was not the same as it had been 24 hours ago, and we all knew it. Owen set down his tea. He said very quietly, "Right, that was all. It was enough." My own communication came 40 minutes later. It was from Director Sato, and it contained 2 pieces of information. The first was that the Council had requested an emergency diplomatic session and had formally asked Earth to send a representative. The second was that I had been selected as Earth's first official diplomatic contact. My instructions were precise. I was to attend the session in person, which meant traveling to the Council's primary meeting station for the first time in the history of human diplomatic engagement. I was to present Earth's formal position, which had been prepared well in advance because Director Sato had been preparing for this moment for many years. And I was to say, before anything else, a specific set of words that he had written himself, and which I was to deliver exactly as written. I read those words several times on the transit to the council station. They were simple, they were clear, and they were, I thought, the most precisely true thing I had ever been asked to say out loud. The council chamber was larger than I had imagined, even though I had reviewed architectural plans of it for years. It seated representatives from 43 species, each in their section, each with their own environmental controls and translation systems. When I walked in, every section was occupied. The gallery above the chamber floor was filled with observers and staff from a dozen more worlds. The room was completely silent. There was no chair for me at the main floor. They had not thought to provide one. A council aide hurried to bring one in from a side room while I stood at the center of the floor and waited. The chair was a standard council design, not built for human proportions, and it sat slightly too low and slightly too wide. I sat in it anyway. The council chair, a tall and clearly unsettled Melhari named Orvith San, opened the session by asking me the question that the whole room clearly wanted to ask. He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I let the silence sit for a moment, not for dramatic effect, because I wanted to answer it correctly. Then I said what Director Sato had written. "We were waiting," I said. "We wanted to see who you really were before we introduced ourselves. We have been watching for 312 years. We have very detailed notes. And now that we have a clear picture, we would like to talk about what happens next." No one in the chamber spoke for a long time. Then Orvith San said carefully, "What does happen next?" I opened the folder on the desk in front of me. The folder contained 17 documents, each one numbered, each one specific, each one the product of years of careful preparation and 3 centuries of patient observation. "That," I said, "depends entirely on which of these you are willing to sign." The session lasted 4 days. I will not describe every hour of it, because 4 days of legal and diplomatic negotiation, even historic negotiation, contains long stretches that are more procedural than thrilling, and this record is meant to be honest rather than flattering. What I will tell you is what mattered and what I will not forget. The 17 documents covered a range of demands that the Council's legal teams initially described as unprecedented. They were not wrong. No species had ever walked into a Council session with a prepared list of structural demands rather than a request for membership or recognition. No species had ever arrived at such a session having already quietly and without announcement resolved the immediate situation that prompted the session through the use of force that the Council's own tactical assessments rated as overwhelming. And no species had ever sat in a chair they brought in themselves in a room full of the most powerful political entities in the galaxy, and spoken with the particular calm that comes from knowing, in precise and well-documented detail, exactly where you stand. The first document addressed Resolution 7 Omicron. It required immediate suspension of all extraction operations authorized under the resolution, and a full review of every system within the affected sector, not by cultural survey teams, but by a joint committee that would include representatives from any inhabited world in the zone, registered or otherwise. This was non-negotiable and was presented as such. The second document concerned the Elian incident specifically. It required formal acknowledgement of the incursion as an unauthorized action against a settled civilian population, reparation payments calculated on a formula Earth provided, and a public correction to the Council's registry, removing Elian's classification as barren and replacing it with the accurate description, inhabited, independent, sovereign. The third through ninth documents addressed the 5 other worlds within the Vega-adjacent sector that Earth's records showed had been affected by previous resource extraction under Council authority. Those worlds had no human connection. They were small, quiet civilizations that the Council's legal structure had simply failed to protect because they were not registered, and because the Council had no particular interest in registering them. Earth had been watching them for a long time. Their names were in our records. Their situations were documented in detail. The Council's legal representatives spent most of the first day objecting that Earth had no standing to represent other species' interests. I pointed out very calmly that since those species had not been offered standing of their own, someone needed to speak, and we were the ones with the documentation and the fleet. This argument was not legally elegant, but it was practically unanswerable, and after several hours the objection was withdrawn. Documents 10 through 16 addressed structural reforms to the pre-contact classification system, establishing monitoring protocols for inhabited systems, independent review processes for resource extraction authorization, and mandatory registration assistance for any species that requested it regardless of their technological status. These were the documents that took the most time. They required changes to policies that had been in place for over 200 years and had benefited powerful council members substantially. The negotiations were detailed and sometimes tense. On the third evening, during a recess, a young Thressi diplomat named Ellen Oru approached me in the corridor outside the chamber. She was perhaps 30 years old by 3i reckoning, which put her in the equivalent of her early 20s in human terms, and she had been sitting in the observer section throughout the session with an expression of focused intensity that I had noticed because it reminded me of Clara Finch. She fell into step beside me and said very quietly, "Can I ask you something?" I said she could. She said, "We always thought your silence meant you were afraid of us, of the Council, of being classified and controlled. We thought you were hiding because you were not ready." She paused. Were we wrong about all of it? I stopped walking. I looked at her. She was very earnest and very young, and she was asking the question that I had spent 20 years thinking about in quiet monitoring bays with cold coffee and the soft hum of equipment around me. "Yes," I said, "you were wrong about all of it." She thought about this. "Then what were you doing?" I had the answer ready because I had been carrying it for a long time. "We were watching," I said. "We wanted to know if the galaxy was worth introducing ourselves to. We wanted to know if the people in charge of it were the kind of people we could work with, honestly. We needed time to find out, and we needed to find out without being managed or classified or given a seat at a table before we understood what the table was for." Ellen Oru was quiet for a moment. "And what did you decide?" she asked. "After all that watching, I thought about 847 council actions in 9 months, and 31 of them showing meaningful improvement. I thought about Owen Farley and Grace Donnell and Peter Huang. I thought about Frances Cole and her 11-second distress call and the 4 words at the end of it. We decided," I said, "that the galaxy has serious problems and that fixing them is going to take a very long time, and that it will go better if we are involved than if we are not." Ellen Oru seemed to consider this carefully. Then she said, "That is perhaps the least flattering reason to join a civilization that I have ever heard." "It is also," I said, the most honest. She smiled at that. It was a small smile, but it was real. The 17th document was the last one and the shortest. It was a single page. It contained Earth's terms for accepting membership in the Galactic Council. Not as a registered pre-contact world, not as a provisional member pending review, but as a full permanent member with veto authority. Effective upon ratification of documents 1 through 16. The Council voted on it at the end of the 4th day. The vote was unanimous. There were 2 abstentions, both from Vreth representatives. both of which were reconsidered within the hour after a private conversation between their senior delegate and Admiral Voss, the content of which I was not present for, and have always felt it would be impolite to speculate about. The vote passed 41-0. When it was done, Orvith San looked across the chamber at me and asked, with what I thought was genuine curiosity, mixed with the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from 4 days of being thoroughly outmaneuvered, whether Earth was satisfied with the outcome. I looked around the chamber. 43 species, the political structure of a galaxy, a room that humanity had watched from the outside for over 3 centuries, and the chair that they had brought in from a side room, and that still sat slightly too low and slightly too wide. Not yet, I said. But we are getting started. I am writing this in Lunar Station 7, which is being decommissioned this spring. After nearly 350 years of operation, the station is being converted into a museum and historical site, which seems appropriate. The monitoring equipment is being removed carefully and archived. The coffee machine, which survived 4 directors and 2 major equipment upgrades, is being donated to the museum collection at the specific and personal request of someone whose name I will not include here, but who absolutely should have let it go. I have been offered a position on Earth's permanent diplomatic staff at the Council, which I have accepted. I will have an office with a properly sized chair. I have been told that the office has a window, which is a small luxury I did not realize I missed until someone mentioned it. It has been 14 months since the Elian session. In that time, the Joint Review Committee established under Document 1 has found 12 inhabited or previously inhabited systems within the Vega-adjacent sector that had been incorrectly classified as barren. 3 of those systems contain active civilizations. 2 of them have already applied for Council registration under the new Assisted Registration Protocol. The 3rd has not decided yet, which is entirely their right, and which I personally think is a very sensible approach given recent history. Reparation payments to Elian were completed in full 8 months ago. The southern continent reconstruction is ongoing. I received a communication from Governor Cole last week. She said the market square in the main city reopened 2 months ago. She said the Football League is planning a new season. She said the northern aquifer is undamaged, and the winter harvest looks good. I read that message 3 times. The 5 other worlds addressed in documents 3 through 9 have all received formal Council acknowledgement of the historical extraction actions conducted in their systems. 2 of those worlds have accepted the Council's offered reparations. 2 others are in ongoing negotiation. The 5th declined any formal engagement with the Council and requested only that their system be left alone, which the Council agreed to in writing, and which Earth is monitoring to ensure the agreement holds. We are still watching. We will always be watching. The difference now is that the galaxy knows it. Ellen Oru was promoted last month to the Thressi Senior Delegation. I heard from her briefly. She said that her government has been reviewing its own policies towards smaller civilizations in their sphere, and that the review is producing uncomfortable findings. She said that she thought this was a good thing, even if it was uncomfortable. I wrote back and told her that this was exactly the right way to think about it. Human medical ships are now operating in 11 sectors that were previously classified as outside Council service zones. Human engineering teams are working on 3 infrastructure projects in systems that had been waiting for Council assistance for over 40 years. Human trade agreements have been signed with 22 Council member species in the last year, and the terms of those agreements are, by any measurable standard, more equitable than the existing Council standard. People keep asking me what we want. Council members, diplomats, journalists, researchers, what does Earth want from all of this? What is the goal? They keep expecting an answer that involves territory or resources, or political influence. Because those are the things that have motivated every other species they have ever dealt with. I tell them what I told Ellen Oru in that corridor. We want to help fix the problems. We believe the galaxy is worth the effort. We are prepared to work on it for a very long time. They find this answer unsatisfying, which I understand. It does not fit the patterns they are used to. It does not include an endgame or a dominant strategy or a territorial claim. It is just a commitment to continued presence and continued work, and in the political vocabulary of the Galactic Council, there is not really a category for that. We are working on creating one. 3 weeks ago, I went back to the chamber where the session was held. I had a meeting with a Council legal team about the ongoing review process and arrived a few minutes early. The chamber was empty. I walked down to the main floor and stood in the center of it, the way I had on the first day. When I had stood there, waiting for someone to bring a chair, the chair was still there. It had been moved to a position at the main table between the Melhari Representative Station and the Thressi Station. Someone had adjusted the height and the width. It fit the space properly now. It looked like it belonged there. I stood looking at it for a while, thinking about 312 years of silence, and about what silence had built, and about the 11 seconds of Francis Cole's voice asking for help, and about Owen Farley, and Grace Donnell and Peter Huang, whose names are engraved on a small memorial that was installed at the entrance to Lunar Station 7 last month before the decommissioning began. Then I sat down in the chair, opened my briefing documents, and waited for the meeting to start. We were always listening, we are still listening, and we are at long last ready to talk.